On May 28, 1940, inside the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, Hermann Göring read an intelligence summary that he found laughable. It described an appeal made days earlier by the American President Franklin Roosevelt, calling on Congress to authorize an aircraft production goal no nation had ever attempted: 50,000 planes per year. Göring scoffed. To him, it was theater, words meant to intimidate, not a plan grounded in reality. The United States, he believed, was a nation of merchants and assembly lines, not war industry. Building automobiles was not the same as building bombers. America, he said, would learn that soon enough. What Göring did not know was that while he dismissed the idea in Berlin, the machinery to make it real was already turning thousands of miles away. In Detroit, a quiet, methodical man named William Knudsen had already begun dismantling Göring's assumptions piece by piece. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had risen to become president of General Motors, had agreed to leave his fortune behind and work for the U.S. government for $1 a year. Roosevelt had put him in charge of something unprecedented, transforming the entire industrial base of the United States for total war. At the moment Roosevelt made his declaration on May 16, 1940, America was woefully unprepared. The country had produced just over 3,600 military aircraft the previous year. The Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 2,000 combat planes, many of them obsolete. The idea of increasing production 14-fold seemed fantastical even to allies. British officials, desperate for American help, privately wondered whether such numbers were even physically possible. But Roosevelt was not speaking in abstractions. He understood something Göring did not. America's strength did not lie in existing weapons, but in its capacity to build them, fast, adaptively, and at scale. The president's speech was not a boast, it was a starting gun. As German armored divisions thundered through France, the United States began a transformation unlike anything the world had seen. Knudsen brought automotive logic to aviation, standardization, interchangeable parts, and relentless focus on throughput. Aircraft manufacturing, once a craft industry dependent on skilled artisans, would become an industrial system. That shift alone would change the war. Inside Nazi Germany, this reality was either ignored or ideologically rejected. German intelligence officers in Washington sent detailed reports warning that American factories were mobilizing with alarming speed. The military attaché General Friedrich von Berthier repeatedly stressed that the United States possessed an industrial depth Germany could not match. In December 1940, he warned that American production would soon reach levels beyond imagination. His reports were dismissed as defeatist exaggeration. When Berthier met Adolf Hitler to discuss American potential, the dictator erupted in racial invective. Americans, Hitler declared, were a degenerate mix, incapable of discipline or sustained effort. Their society, in his view, could not endure sacrifice. This was not analysis. It was ideology, and it would prove fatal. By late 1941, American factories were already producing 2,000 military aircraft per month. That number would keep rising. Companies that had never built aircraft before were brought into the system. Automobile plants were retooled. Appliance manufacturers learned to machine precision components. Entire supply chains were rebuilt from scratch. One project came to symbolize both the ambition and the risk of this effort: Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan. Construction began in April 1941 on what would become the largest factory under a single roof in the world. It covered more than 3 million square feet. Its assembly line would stretch for a mile. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, made a staggering promise. Willow Run, he said, would produce one heavy bomber every hour. At first, it was a disaster. The B-24 Liberator was among the most complex machines ever built. The first aircraft completed at Willow Run in September 1942 was so poorly assembled it had to be stripped down and rebuilt. Defect rates soared. By early 1943, the plant was producing a fraction of its promised output. Critics mocked it as, "Will it run?" But failure did not stop production. It refined it. Engineers broke the bomber into thousands of subassemblies. Riveting became mechanized. Wiring harnesses were pre-assembled. design changes, hundreds of them, were integrated without halting the line. Ford applied lessons learned in automobile production on a scale no aircraft company had ever attempted. By the fall of 1943, Willow Run's output surged. By December, it was producing more than 300 bombers a month. In April 1944, it reached the unimaginable one completed B-24 every 63 minutes, day and night. A single American factory was producing more heavy bombers than Germany's entire aviation industry. German pilots were among the first to grasp what this meant. During the fighting in North Africa, Luftwaffe aces noticed something unsettling. American aircraft losses were being replaced with alarming speed. New squadrons arrived fully equipped. The enemy was not running out of planes or pilots. In January 1943, American bombers struck Germany itself for the first time. By October, during the raid on Schweinfurt, the Americans lost dozens of bombers in a single day and replaced them within weeks. The arithmetic of war had shifted. Germany could no longer trade losses evenly. The balance sheet was against them. As 1943 turned into 1944, the scale of American production became overwhelming. Fighters, bombers, engines, aluminum, fuel, everything flowed in quantities Germany could not disrupt. When Allied air forces launched Big Week in February 1944, they flew thousands of sorties directly against German aircraft production. The Luftwaffe lost planes, but more devastatingly it lost veteran pilots it could never replace. Inside Germany, Göring's promises rang hollow. He assured Hitler that new weapons and reorganized production would restore air superiority, but the numbers no longer supported belief. German factories bombed and dispersed, struggled to meet quotas. American factories expanded faster than bombs could slow them. By mid-1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. American aircraft filled the skies from Normandy to Poland. Escort fighters ranged deep into the Reich. German pilots spoke of endless bomber streams stretching from horizon to horizon. 8 fighters against hundreds. Courage could not overcome arithmetic. The war in the air was no longer a contest of tactics or bravery. It was an industrial avalanche, and it had begun with a speech Göring laughed at in May 1940. By 1944, the production gap had become a chasm. That year alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Germany had managed throughout the entire war. Heavy bombers rolled off assembly lines by the hundreds. Fighters emerged in such numbers that losses became a logistical inconvenience rather than a strategic crisis. The United States was not merely supplying an air force. It was sustaining 2 global wars separated by oceans without exhausting its industrial core. The disparity went far beyond raw numbers. American aircraft arrived fully equipped, armed, and standardized. Bombers carried powered turrets, advanced bomb sights, and reliable radios. Fighters arrived with full ammunition loads and spare parts waiting at depots thousands of miles away. German aircraft increasingly flew with shortages, ammunition rationed, radios unreliable, engines pushed beyond their limits. The Luftwaffe was being hollowed out not by inferior engineering but by an inability to sustain production under pressure. The contrast was visible on the factory floor. In the United States, production expanded upward and outward. Boeing's plants around Seattle operated around the clock, delivering heavy bombers at a pace no one had imagined in 1940. Douglas Aircraft grew from a modest manufacturer into a vast industrial empire, employing more than 160,000 workers across multiple states. North American aviation produced hundreds of long-range fighters every month. Lockheed refined the art of continuous modification, implementing thousands of combat-driven improvements without halting output. Behind these assembly lines stood a supply network that matched their speed. Aluminum production multiplied several times over. Engine manufacturing surged as companies with no prior aviation experience mastered precision metallurgy. Chemical firms expanded fuel and lubricant output to meet demands that dwarfed peacetime consumption. The American industrial system did not bottleneck, it scaled. One factor shattered German assumptions more completely than any statistic: The workforce itself. Nazi ideology could not imagine women as a decisive industrial force. In the United States, women flooded into factories by the hundreds of thousands. They riveted fuselages, assembled wiring harnesses, inspected instruments, and ran quality control stations with relentless precision. At Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant, women comprised more than half the workforce. Defect rates fell as they took over inspection roles. At Willow Run, women learned to drive thousands of rivets per shift with near-perfect accuracy. Tools were redesigned for smaller hands, which unexpectedly improved efficiency for everyone. Injuries declined, fatigue decreased, productivity rose. German intelligence interpreted this as desperation. Reports described female labor as a temporary measure that would inevitably degrade quality. Instead, American aircraft became more reliable with each production run. The assumption that democratic societies lacked discipline collapsed under the weight of measurable results. While America expanded in the open, Germany retreated underground. In early 1944, Göring approved the dispersal of aircraft production into hundreds of concealed sites. Entire factories were relocated into tunnels and caves, worked by enslaved laborers under horrific conditions. The goal was survival, escape Allied bombing by hiding production from the air. The result was catastrophic. Components moved between sites across bombed rail networks. Quality control disintegrated. Sabotage became common. Workers forced to labor under starvation and brutality had every incentive to damage what they built. Engines failed. Airframes cracked. Output fell, even as resources were consumed at unprecedented rates. One underground complex alone consumed tens of thousands of lives while producing fewer engines per month than a single American plant operating above ground. Germany was expending human lives to protect an industrial system that could no longer compete. Meanwhile, American innovation accelerated rather than slowed. The B-29 superfortress emerged as a technological leap beyond anything Germany could field in numbers. Pressurized cabins, advanced fire control systems, long-range navigation, features integrated through modular production across multiple facilities. Parts built in different states fit together seamlessly. Entire bombers were assembled from interchangeable components with minimal adjustment. Germany pursued its own technological miracle, the jet fighter. Faster than anything in the Allied inventory, it promised salvation through speed. But salvation requires scale. German jet engines burned out after a handful of hours. Fuel shortages crippled training. Spare parts were scarce. Production never exceeded a trickle. The aircraft's brilliance could not overcome the reality that it existed in dozens, while the enemy flew in thousands. The United States pursued jet development simultaneously without abandoning conventional production. It could afford to. Even experimental failures did not threaten output. Industrial depth allowed redundancy. If one program stalled, others continued. Germany, fighting from scarcity, gambled everything on miracles it could not mass produce. The consequences became unmistakable. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces crossed the English Channel under the protection of nearly 12,000 aircraft. German forces managed a few hundred sorties in response. The skies belonged to the invaders not because of tactical brilliance alone, but because years of industrial expansion had made any other outcome impossible. In the months that followed, bomber formations grew larger still. Single raids involved thousands of aircraft. Escort fighters ranged across the continent, hunting at will. German pilots spoke of American fighters appearing everywhere at once, swarming without pause. Losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained, let alone built. Inside the Nazi leadership, reality finally intruded. Production figures no longer aligned with promises. Internal reports acknowledged that losses exceeded output. Veteran pilots were gone. Fuel was scarce. Factories were fragmented shadows of what they once were. Joseph Goebbels privately admitted that Germany was fighting the world's greatest industrial power with slogans. Even Hitler, long insulated by ideology, conceded the error. American industry, he admitted, had been decisive. It was not the quality of German soldiers that failed. but the inability of the state to match the enemy's productive capacity. By the time this realization surfaced, it was far too late. As Allied bombs fell and front lines closed in, the production war reached its conclusion. America had not simply built more aircraft, it had built a system that learned, adapted, and expanded under pressure. German industry, rigid and brutalized, collapsed inward. The skies over Europe told the story more clearly than any report. Endless formations of bombers and fighters moved with mechanical certainty, the visible expression of an economy fully mobilized for war. The Reich air marshal who once laughed at a speech now faced the arithmetic of defeat, written in aluminum, fuel, and steel. By the final year of the war, the scale of American production had reached proportions that defied historical precedent. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 96,000 military aircraft, heavy bombers, fighters, transports, trainers. Entire categories of aviation emerged in quantities that rendered previous benchmarks meaningless. That single year surpassed Germany's total aircraft output for the entire conflict. The numbers were only part of the shock. Each American bomber represented not just an airframe, but a fully integrated system. Engines, armament, navigation, communications, spare parts, trained crews, maintenance units, fuel, and logistics followed behind it automatically. Germany increasingly struggled to field aircraft that could remain operational for more than a handful of sorties. American squadrons rotated losses seamlessly. Aircraft destroyed in combat were replaced faster than German factories could report them missing. This industrial dominance reshaped every battlefield decision. Allied planners no longer asked whether air power could support an operation, but how much of it to allocate. In the build-up to Normandy, preparatory bombing dropped more tonnage on German infrastructure in 5 months than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain during the entire war. Rail lines, bridges, factories, and fuel depots were pulverized in a systematic campaign that Germany could neither stop nor replace. Transport aircraft delivered entire airborne divisions in a single day using fleets larger than Germany's total air transport capacity at its peak. Supply lines stretched across oceans with clockwork regularity. When units advanced, equipment followed. When losses occurred, replacements arrived. The war became an exercise in sustained pressure Germany could not relieve. Inside the collapsing Reich, leaders searched for explanations that preserved pride. Hermann Göring insisted that German technology had been superior, that defeat came only through enemy numbers. But even this justification eroded under scrutiny. Quantity was not accidental. It was the product of organization, adaptability, and a labor system that rewarded initiative rather than crushed it. Captured German officials admitted the truth in fragments. Albert Speer later acknowledged that Allied bombing crippled German armaments production in decisive sectors. Tanks, aircraft, and vehicles fell far below required levels. Efforts to compensate through forced labor failed catastrophically. Productivity declined, even as brutality increased. The system devoured itself. When Germany's jet fighter entered combat, it demonstrated extraordinary performance, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Engines failed after hours. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Pilots trained on gliders were sent into combat against veteran opponents flying aircraft built in the thousands. Innovation without production proved meaningless. By contrast, the United States pursued multiple technological paths simultaneously. Even when early jet programs faltered, conventional aircraft production surged ahead unchanged. Industrial redundancy ensured no single failure could derail output. This depth of capacity was something Germany had never possessed and never understood. As Allied armies closed in during 1945, Göring was captured without resistance. In interrogation, his certainty dissolved. He fixated on production statistics, repeatedly comparing single American factories to Germany's entire aviation output. One plant, he admitted, had done more damage to the Luftwaffe than years of air combat. During questioning, he expressed astonishment at American logistics. Supplying armies across 2 oceans while maintaining domestic production had been beyond German conception. Germany, he admitted, could barely supply forces a few hundred miles from its borders. The realization haunted him. At Nuremberg, prosecutors confronted Göring with charts and film footage. Endless assembly lines, bomber formations stretching beyond the horizon, month-by-month production totals that dwarfed German annual figures. He struggled to reconcile them with the assumptions he had held in 1940. Growth on that scale, he said, had seemed physically impossible. Prison psychologists noted his obsession with numbers. He recalculated ratios compulsively, as if the right equation might make defeat comprehensible. One factory, he muttered, had broken their backs. The arithmetic of war had proven unforgiving. In his final reflections, Göring conceded the central truth. Germany had not been defeated by better soldiers or superior courage, but by better factories. The nation he dismissed as decadent and soft had mobilized its population voluntarily and outproduced a totalitarian state built for command and control. The transformation went far beyond aircraft. Nearly 2 million Americans worked in aviation production at its peak. Women, minorities, immigrants, teenagers, and older workers filled roles once considered impossible for them. People who had never seen an aircraft up close became skilled builders of the most complex machines on Earth. They did not just meet quotas, they improved them. The techniques developed under wartime pressure reshaped global industry, statistical quality control, modular assembly, automated tooling. Methods pioneered to build bombers became the foundation of post-war manufacturing. The engineers who optimized production lines would later build rockets. The workers who mastered precision assembly would fuel decades of economic growth. When the war ended, the industrial base remained. Aluminum plants fed housing booms. Chemical facilities created new consumer materials. Machine tool factories equipped a generation of businesses. War production did not bankrupt the United States. It ended the Great Depression and launched unprecedented prosperity. The lesson was unmistakable. Free societies, when threatened, could mobilize resources with a speed and efficiency that coercion could not match. Voluntary cooperation outperformed forced labor. Information flowed faster. Adaptation occurred sooner. Innovation multiplied. Hermann Göring's initial contempt for American production capacity stands as one of history's most costly miscalculations. He mistook peace for weakness and consumer abundance for industrial fragility. By the time reality corrected him, his nation lay in ruins. The skies filled with American aircraft were not merely instruments of war, they were proof of a system that could learn, scale, and endure. Each bomber and fighter represented thousands of individual decisions made freely by people who believed in the cause they served. In the end, the production war decided everything. Front lines moved because factories made them move. Battles were won because supply never failed. Strategy bowed to arithmetic. Democracy, armed with industry, proved unstoppable. Göring's laughter in 1940 echoed into silence by 1945. The numbers answered him, the factories answered him, and history rendered its verdict.